I'm so glad that you're here and you've been able to join us on these weekly conversations. We've been going through the book of 1 Peter, and we found ourselves, we've hit on chapter 1, chapter 2, and chapter 3, and now there's this question that Peter is asking every person of faith. And the question really is, what are the markers of a believer? And if I would maybe take it to another level, what are the markers of a person of faith? Have you ever been considered someone that would know that you hear the voice of God, that you express the characteristics of God? And if you were ever curious, what are those things that distinguish someone that is a follower of Jesus, someone that is a lover of God, someone that has been baptized into the life of Jesus, has died to themselves and has become new? Some of that terminology can come off as Christianese and churchy, but nevertheless, the question is, how can I distinguish myself as a person of God? Peter dives in a very practical way, probably the most practical in this entire book. And he's talking about submission and submitting to God as our master. He's talking about how a husband and a wife should come together and how they should realize that as they are people of faith, what their lives should look like. And then he takes it directly, both individually into the church. So if you find yourself as a person of faith, I want to speak to you in regards to what Peter's saying. And if you find yourself in our community, in Coin Church, if you were to consider yourself a part of our tribe, I want to speak to you directly and specifically. You see, there's something about becoming new, and there's something about walking away from your old self. I don't think anyone would argue that we like new things. We like stuff that's fresh. We like getting in a car that smells clean. There's like fresh air. We like walking outside and feeling the breeze and going to the beach and the fresh air. We love what it seems like to be new, the reality, the dimension of newness. And yet, I don't think anyone would argue as we look back, we don't want the old. We don't want things that just become groggy and simple and mundane. And so if you desire to be a person of faith, Peter will walk you through a couple of things. And I have a couple of just main points. I honestly am only going to be reading verses 8 to 12 of chapter 3. And so let's read it together. He says, "Finally, all of you, be like-minded." Just right out the start, all of you, those that have been raised in the church, those that have found themselves finding yourself in Christ, those that have desired to step out of the old and into the new, all of you that are in our community, that are abroad, every single human being with different backgrounds and upbringings, all of you, be like-minded. And that's sometimes very simple to say, but probably the most hardest thing to do in a community. You see, one thing I love about church is we gather together and you grew up in your background with your family, with your mother and your father. You grew up in another background and maybe you were just raised by your mother, or maybe you were just raised by your father. Maybe you grew up in a private school, a Christian school, or a public school. Whatever dimension of reality of life that you grew up in, all of you is a reminder that we all have different perspectives and different ideologies and sometimes even different agendas. Yet at the same time, the first thing that Peter wants to tell you and me is be like-minded. Find something in common that will stand firm in your reality of community. Find yourself like-minded in one another, loving one another, taking care of one another. Instead of just being all over the place, instead of creating division, instead of finding things that you can diminish one another and put down one another, let's be like-minded. And then he goes on to say, be sympathetic. Love one another, be compassionate and be humble. Do not repay evil with evil or insult with insult, because to this you were called so that you may inherit a blessing. And then he quotes Psalm 34 and he says, "Whoever would love life and see good days must keep their tongue from evil." Watch what you say. Watch how you say it. Watch what comes out of your mouth. And their lips from deceitful speech. They must turn from evil, turn from the old, get rid of the old, dismantle the old, relinquish the old, and do good. Step into the new. They must seek peace and pursue it. For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are attentive to their prayers. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. And I don't know about you, but I think about evil and good. I think about humility, and I think about compassion. I think about being like-minded and being loving towards one another. And there's this really true reality of darkness and of light. And I honestly think when we are in the old, every crevice of darkness is in our soul. And everything that is anti-God is what is inside of us. It really does feel like that. We want to be resentful towards people. We want to be angry towards people. We want to create division and create rumor. That seems to be when we are just at our neutral self, our default. And there's a tendency to become your old self and to live in a reality of darkness. But everyone loves light. I mean, I don't know who doesn't like light. When I wake up in the morning and I walk outside, it's almost as if feeling the cool, fresh breeze. But then there's this sensation on your skin of the sun, and it's warm and it's inviting and it's filled with joy. And every single time I think of the gospel and the good news of God, every single time I desire to be a person of God, I'm reminded that it is faith and it is light that moves me through the darkness. So he goes on to say, be sympathetic. And one thing that's clear, I wrote this down. Sympathy and selfishness cannot coexist. Have you ever thought about this for a moment? That if we desire to be sympathetic, if we desire to mourn with those that mourn and rejoice with those that rejoice, if we desire to put ourselves in other people's shoes, we cannot have selfishness in our soul. That is a crevice of our old self that we must get rid of, because you see, they don't dance well together. They don't coexist at all. Selfishness and sympathy. So Peter says, if you desire to be a person of faith, this is the marker. Be sympathetic. As long as the self is the most important part and thing in your world, there can be no such thing as sympathy. And then he goes on to say, love one another. Pretty simple, right? If you want to be and step out of the old and desire to be new, if you want to become good and get away from evil, if you want to give people blessing instead of giving them insult, then love one another. When we look at the perfect marker of a person of faith, of a person of God, we find ourselves every single time with the standard of Jesus. I desire every single day to be a person just like Jesus. And here's the thing, I'm probably going to fall short every single day. And that's where humility really comes into play. You see, because if I desire to hold a standard that is higher than myself, that is higher than my brothers and sisters, that is higher than the smartest person in the world, well, what's going to happen is when they fall, I'm just going to, they can fall, and so I'm probably going to be bound to fall too. Or they didn't show love the way that I would expect them to, and they're my marker, and so it's going to be really hard for me now to feel like I can love people because they are not loving people well. But when we look at the person of Jesus, we find ourselves, as John would say in his book, those who say, I love God and hate their brothers and sisters are liars. So here's the reality. Every single day is a challenge to be like-minded. Every single day there's a challenge to be sympathetic. Every single day, if I were to call you to more, I would tell you, though it is simple in word, it is difficult in deed. Love one another. Care for one another. Be there in community. Be there to mourn and to love and to shed light and to shed encouragement It's simple, but love one another. You see, all who hate if you have hate in your heart, by John in the scriptures, who was a disciple of Jesus, he would say, then you can't love God. It's almost the same thing. It's about that coexisting reality. If you say you love God, but yet you can't stand your brother or sister, well, you're a liar. You don't love God then. If you say that you love God and yet you can't forgive your mother, well, you're a liar and you don't love God really. Because if we were to really desire to love God and to be a person of faith, a person of Jesus, then we must get rid of everything that is dark and step into everything that is light. The next is to have compassion, and not just in action, but get this, have compassion in your emotional mindset. So there's compassion that shows action, and then there's also compassion that is inward. How are you thinking about the person sitting next to you? Are you just faking it? Are you just making it seem like you love them and you care about them? Are you being compassionate in one conversation? Or in the deepest part of your soul, do you truly love this person? Or is it just an emotional facade? You see, something about compassion is, I was thinking about this just earlier today, is compassion and jealousy can't coexist either. You see, jealousy is looking at someone and saying, you have something that I don't have. And in other words, I don't really trust God because there's something about your life that you have that I won't have, and I just don't believe that I can have it. And so now I'm bitter and upset. And now I can't show compassion. Now I can't be like-minded with you. Now I can't even be humble towards myself and desire to be a person of God because there's just something in my soul it's corroding who I am, and it's desiring to pull me away from the newness of being a person of God. And then the last really is, he says, be compassionate and then be humble. So humble is another part of the marker of Jesus. And Jesus constantly, over and over and over again, always said, I'll be the low one. No, I'll wrap my robe around me. I'll take my robe off and actually clean your feet instead of wearing my garment showing that I have authority. You see, if you want to really desire to be a person of God, then find yourself in humility everywhere you go. In every conversation you have with believers or non-believers, with those that consider themselves followers of Jesus or those that are really trying to figure it out. If you truly want to be a person of faith, have humility. Meaning don't puff yourself up. Meaning don't act like you know it all. Meaning don't act like you have all the answers. Meaning don't make it seem like you're better than the other person. Instead, desire the seat of humility. And the scripture says that God actually, he opposes the proud and he uplifts the humble. And that should encourage us because there's something about humility and it's something that it does to your soul. You see, in order to live the life of righteousness, Peter goes on to talk about not to repay insult to insult. And then he shares something that I want to encourage you as a community. He says, because of this, you were called. You were called, you were set apart. God spoke to you. You heard the voice of God. Someone spoke light into your life. And there was all of a sudden this awakening in your soul, and you were called. You were set apart. And Jesus spoke everything that you are into today, into reality. Goodness and mercy and peace and joy. You were called. And then he says, so that you may inherit a blessing. And then he goes on to quote the Psalms that talk about really the posture to which we live will beckon the eyes of God on us and bring blessing in our life. And this really, if I'll be honest, is a mystery of God. And I think too often times in the Western world, we just have to have an answer for every little thing. And I'm just going to put it out there. I love that this is a mystery. That there's something that the psalmist reminds me of that when I desire to do good, when I desire to shut my mouth up, and instead of do evil, do good, when I desire to listen to the voice of God and to be attentive to what he's calling me to do, when be attentive to the prayers, then the reality is, at least from what the scriptures tell me, is that I will be blessed. Regardless if it's an inheritance of heaven or if it's an inheritance here on earth, I will be blessed if I pursue righteousness. And you know, sometimes we can make righteousness to be like this really big, rambunctious, ambiguous, out of the world type of thing to hold on to, but it's very simple actually. Righteousness, as Peter would point out, is being like-minded. So it's not being divisive. Righteousness is to be sympathetic. It's not to not care about people. It's not to shun them away. Righteousness is to love one another with deep sincerity. It's to have compassion, and righteousness is humility. Righteousness is when someone does you dirty, not trying to repay them back, not trying to hurt them back. Righteousness is, as Jesus would say, if someone tells you, pick up and walk a mile as my servant because you're a Jew and you're below me and I'm a Roman centurion and I'm a soldier, so you do as I say. So Jew, Christian, follower of God, why don't you just do everything I say? Let me mock you and ridicule you. Let me remind you of the submission that you have on this world, as Peter would write to this church that has found themselves in a deep amount of persecution. Peter flips the script and he says, no. The more that you repay evil with good, the more you desire righteousness. And the more God actually hears you, is for you and not against you. I want to remind you of this as we close, that you are a person of faith. That if you didn't know this, and if you are so far from God, you feel you can't even get close, remind yourself right now that if there's light outside, that God is so near to you. As soon as you walk out and feel the warmth of the sun, just remind yourself that everywhere you go, you can find God. That he is actually one conversation away. He is actually in the community of believers that find themselves pursuing righteousness. Not to condemn you, not to tell you that you're not good enough, but I desire to be a part of a community that works really hard at loving God, works really hard at doing good, works really hard at being in one accord. Because the more we are together, the stronger we are in this world. I love you guys. I'm praying for you. I desire you to know more of God. I desire you every single day to make a choice. I am going to desire righteousness. I am going to be a person of God. And these are the markers of God. I love you, and we'll see you next week.